Yom HaShoah, which loosely translates from Hebrew to English, is Holocaust Remembrance Day, was officially established as a holiday by the Israeli government in the 1950s. In the United States, Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is today, May 2nd, was first observed in 1979. It is now a day of commemoration for people worldwide. It memorializes the lives and heroism of Jewish people and other faiths who died in the Holocaust between 1933 and 1945. Commemorations typically include memorial services and communal vigils and educational programs. These programs often include talks by Holocaust survivors, although this is becoming less common as time passes and there are fewer survivors who remain alive. Candlelighting ceremonies, the recitation of memorial prayers, and appropriate songs and readings are also conducted. Some communities read the names of Holocaust victims or show Holocaust-themed films. It is important for us to remember and recall the victims of this catastrophe, which occurred then, and there are unfortunately victims in recent history of hate crimes. And we should ensure that such tragedies don't happen again. In Israel, on the eve of Yom HaShoah and on the day itself, places of public entertainment are closed by law. Israeli television airs Holocaust documentaries and low-keyed songs are played on the radio. Flags on public buildings are flown at half-mast. And at 10 a.m., an air raid siren sounds throughout the country, and Israelis are expected to observe 2 minutes of solemn reflection. Almost everyone stops what they are doing, including motorists who stop their cars in the middle of the road, even on highways, and stand beside their vehicles in silence as the siren sounds. I'd like to ask all of us to please rise and observe a moment of silence for those who senselessly lost their lives in the Holocaust, and also in honor of the most recent ones who have lost their lives in crimes of hatred in our country. Thank you. And before you leave the room today, please stop and light a candle. We have these little electric ones. Just light a candle in memory of those who lost their lives. I want to thank you all for taking the time today to help us commemorate Yom HaShoah in Nassau County. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of many elected officials who are joined with us today. We have a state senator, Anna Kaplan. We have State Assemblyman Tony Durso. We have from the town of North Hempstead, Councilwoman Veronica Lurvy. We have from the JCRC Long Island, Mindy Perlmutter and Adam Novick. We have legislators, my fellow legislators with us, Szilagyi, Muley, Drucker, and DeRigi Witten. Thank you. We have our Nassau County Comptroller, Jack Schneerman. We also have Marianella Casas from the police, and we have Commissioner Ryder with us as well. We have, I should include Judge Birnbaum from the village of Great Neck. We have our District Attorney, Madeline Singas. We are joined by Legislator Ford. We have a very informative program for you this afternoon, which includes speakers from the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Nassau County. And if you haven't had a chance to visit it, it's in Glen Cove, and it's really a jewel. You'll be hearing from the chairman, Steve Markowitz, the director of youth education, Helen Turner, a Holocaust survivor who is a docent and educator at the center, Murray Taub, and a high school student who is a junior advisory board member, as well as from my legislative aide, Josephine Morazadeh. But first, before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone who really doesn't need an introduction. She's so ably leading our county, and she shows dignity and compassion to all people in this county. So I'm proud to call up at this time County Executive Laura Curran.
Thank you very much, Legislator Birnbaum, and thank you for hosting this very, very important event. I'm going to keep my remarks short because you have a wonderful program of speakers. I just want to say we were at Congregation Shirai Shalom yesterday evening. The police commissioner was there, and I think some of you were there as well. And I talked about some statistics that I think you cannot repeat enough, and I'm sorry if you've already heard this. I'll just give you a couple of them. Anti-Semitism is on the rise globally, and I think a lot of that has to do with ignorance of history, ignorance of the past. There was a poll done last year that found some troubling statistics. I'll just give you a couple of them. That half of the people in the United States think that 2 million or less people perished in the Holocaust. A third or less. 2/3 of millennials, 2/3 of young adults don't know what Auschwitz is or was. They have no knowledge of it. We know what happened, us in this room. What I think about is what hasn't happened. 6 million people murdered. I think about what diseases have not been cured, what symphonies have not been written, what weddings never happened, what jokes were never told. We won't know what we've missed. But we can resolve to work together to make sure that people know what happened and to take every effort possible to make sure it doesn't happen again. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Legislator Birnbaum. I thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Okay, now I'd like to call up the man who is the chairman of the board of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, somebody I'm proud to call my friend and who's been doing a great job at the HMTC for the last 7 years, Steve Markowitz.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to our county executive and to our district attorney and to the police commissioner who have done just a fantastic job in responding to all the hate crimes and understanding the concerns that the Jewish community as well as the overall community has about the rise in hate. And their responsiveness really makes us feel comforted and confident that they've got our backs. Just like that, just a word about, Ellen was talking about the history of Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah, the date was picked because it marks the day of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, very historic date, which was the first time that in an organized way, that the Jews in Europe are being slaughtered actually stood up and said, no, well, if we die, we're going to die in dignity. So it became a very, very important date. I'd just like to make a few brief remarks. One is that Yom HaShoah is a very somber day, somber in the sense that we're mourning the loss of so many people of all ages. And as the county executive said, who knows what the world lost as part of that in terms of what could have been accomplished. But it's also somber because 2019, ladies and gentlemen, and I feel very confident in saying this, is the most dangerous time in the history of the Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust. What's going on worldwide is beyond anything we ever could have anticipated or believed could happen. And it's not just the Jewish community. What happened to the Muslims in New Zealand, the slaughter there, what happened in the Catholic churches in Sri Lanka, what happens in black churches in the United States, and then, of course, what happened in Pittsburgh, what happened in Poway, California. It reminds us that the forces of evil are still with us. And Yom HaShoah is a time for not just reflecting on the past, but it's a time to reflect on how we're going to deal with the current situation. I have a couple of quick slides I wanted to show you. Helen, can you? This is a picture of a parade in Belgium. Took place about 2 months ago. And what it was picture of floats of characters dressed up as religious Jews, the most heinous anti-Semitic vision that you can imagine. This happened in 2019. Let's go to the next one. This is 1934, Cologne, Germany. Looks pretty similar, huh? The fact is, in 2019, something like happened It was so similar to what happened in 1934 in Germany. Let's go to the next one. You're all familiar with the famous cartoon that was in the Times about 4 or 5 days ago, trying to make a political point, but done with the most horrible anti-Semitic tropes you can imagine. The German dog, the Jewish star, the poor president being led around by this Jew pulling him. This is in 2019 in the New York Times. It was the international edition. Nevertheless, this was allowed to happen. Here we go, 1934 again. Der Stürmer in Germany. Again, the similarities are overwhelming. And I could have shown you slides, I didn't prepare, about the parade in Charlottesville, Virginia, when there were people marching through the streets in 2018 in the United States with flags with swastikas on it and chanting anti-Jewish slogans. We could have certainly found many slides of pictures of parades in Germany looking exactly the same. And how about pictures inside the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and Tree of Life Synagogue, and the synagogue in Poway, California, shot up, bullet holes, blood all over the floor. That could have been 1938 Kristallnacht in Germany. Exactly the same thing. So the message is, it's then and now. It's not gone away. And Yom HaShoah is really what that's what it's about. And we cannot allow the concerns about Israeli government policy, which many of us may have our own personal questions about. We can't allow those people who are attacking Israel for what it may be doing or not doing for their own reasons, allow that to morph into clear and unambivalent anti-Semitism. That cannot be allowed to use as an excuse. You can't allow people to hate Jews because they don't like what Netanyahu is doing. And we've seen that kind of thing going on. The final thing I want to say is Holocaust did not start with concentration camps. People think of Holocaust as the first thing comes to their minds. That's not how it started. It started with graffiti. It started with name-calling. It started with bullying. It started with isolated incidents of violence against Jews. That's how it started. And what are we seeing today? Graffiti, bullying, shootings, whatever. And the only way we can stand up to this is we cannot be indifferent. The Holocaust happened for one reason. The Holocaust is allowed to happen because the world was indifferent. When the world had a chance in 1937, 1938, 1939 to accept Jews from Germany, to give them a chance to get out, and the nations of the world met to try to figure out who's going to take them. Only one country in the world, one country out of 100 or so, said we'd take some Jews. And that country was the Dominican Republic. And they took a few hundred. And that was it. The rest of the world said, we're not interested, we don't care. And that gave Hitler the license to say, the world doesn't care, I can do what I want. And that's what we're fighting against today, indifference. And indifference at the national level, and then what we're going to be talking about now is indifference at the local level and within our schools and everything else. What we're teaching is indifference allows hate to exist. And if we don't teach kids to stand up, to speak out when they see something going on, and adults as well, then we're doomed to repeat history. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce a very special woman. Helen Turner is our Director of Youth Education at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. Helen just celebrated a very special day. Last week, Helen became a United States citizen. Her accent will let you know where she's from originally. And Helen has done just a magnificent job working with schools throughout Nassau County and Suffolk County, where we have between 15 and 20,000 kids a year educated on the history of the Holocaust, but more importantly, the lessons of the Holocaust, what it means to how you act today. So with that, Helen Turner. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much, Legislator Birnbaum, and thank you, Mr. Markowitz, for asking me to be here today, and to everyone who is here representing this amazing county. I'm delighted to be speaking with you. As it says behind me, my name is Helen Turner, and I'm the Director of Youth Education. So I very rarely get to talk to grown-ups. So it's very nice to talk to a different crowd. But I do work with children all across this island. I work with thousands of school children from all different districts, all different socioeconomic standings, all different faiths, with one message. And that message is tolerance. And we teach that message through Holocaust education. So I became the Director of Youth Education in 2017. And since that time, across America, incidents regarding hate and bias have been on the rise. We've seen different instances of anti-Semitism. I don't know if we can dim the lights a little. Yeah. This is an image of students from Suffolk County, from Comac. These students are playing beer pong, and their beer pong team name is Team Auschwitz. This is another image of Islamophobia, someone's home that has been defaced, that actually says Muslims go home, when this is a private residence. What are these tormentors trying to say? Homophobia. This is an image I use a lot with students. When I was growing up, we had a wonderful family car. It was one of those big ones where me and my brothers all piled in after soccer events, and we were yelling at each other, we were playing different things on the radio. A lot of action happened in this car. It was our family car. And when I saw this image, when I was looking for images of homophobia, I noticed the decal on the back of that car. And if you guys can see it, it's white. It's mom, mom, kid, dog. I would look at that and think, how beautiful. Someone else looked at this and wrote a hate word on that car. How do those parents explain that to that child? What do they do? How do they feel cleaning that graffiti off? We're also seeing a rise in anti-immigrant and anti-Latino racism. Someone decided to write on a sidewalk, "I hate Mexicans." And so what does all this tell us? What are all these images coming together to say? The ADL is releasing a lot of reports on different rises, particularly in anti-Semitism. In 2018 and 2019, there were 1,799 incidents of extremism or anti-Semitism in the United States. The ADL just released a new report this week, and reports that anti-Semitic assaults in New York are up 55% from 2017 to 2018. So how does this affect us? How does it affect the people in this room? We see it in the headlines. We're seeing a lot of things talking about different incidents, particularly in schools. And of course, that's my field, that's where I come in. So we're not only seeing it on a national level, we're also seeing it very locally. And this is really the beginning of my story. As I told you, I became the Director of Youth Education in 2017. And in that summer, the late summer, early fall of that year, we had the march in Charlottesville, and we also had this particular incident in Syosset High School. I went to the school immediately. I was asked to go and be there. And I'm looking at the hate graffiti that was all over the wall, the back wall of that school. And the principal and I were having a discussion that perhaps what the students need is Holocaust education. That's what's missing, right? But we all saw that first slide that I showed where the team, the beer pong team, they were Team Auschwitz, and it was spelt correctly. So my friends, what we need is not only to educate our students, but to connect them to this history. This cannot be a simple history lesson where they memorize dates and facts. We need to get them to feel what this is, to understand how anti-Semitism, hate, racism, Islamophobia relates to every human being in this room. This is a quote from a student that I work with. I went into her school after there was another incident of anti-Semitic graffiti, and this is what the student said. "It was extremely difficult to see these things and somehow manage to feel safe in my community." This is a Long Island high schooler who no longer feels safe. That is what we need to respond to. How do we make our students feel safe? How do we make ourselves feel safe? How do we unite with our message of tolerance? So HMTC has responded to this with our newest program. It's called Understanding Impact, Deconstructing Symbols of Hate. Now, this is an interesting way of doing it because previously, in its first rendition, it was simply deconstructing symbols of hate. But I realized after doing this presentation a number of times that what was missing was that understanding, getting students to realize the impact of their actions. Working with the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, I work with a lot of young offenders, students who have made racist graffiti on a school building or a public property, who have done very hateful things with Snapchat or Instagram. And I meet with these students, and so many times they tell me they didn't understand. It was stupid, they weren't thinking. And so it's really getting students to understand the impact of their actions. But it can't stop with kids. It's also the impact of our actions. How do we raise our voice against intolerance? How do we say what we will allow and what we will not? So the whole point of what we're trying to do is to empower students and you to act. This is one of my favorite slides that I use in almost every presentation I show. This is a man who got onto a New York City subway also in 2017. He walked onto the subway and he was confronted with that message that is across the map. It reads, "Jews belong in the oven." Now, as I said, I usually work with students when I do these sorts of programs. And I had one student, so sweet, sitting in the front row. And she said, "Miss, I don't know what that means." And I said, what it means is that during the Holocaust, as millions were murdered, after they were gassed, their bodies were burned in crematoria, and they were reduced to ashes. And someone walked onto a New York City subway and decided to write that so that everyone would know how they felt. And the reason I show this slide is because I don't know what I would do if I got on this New York City subway. I don't know if you can tell, I'm a shy person. I'm actually very afraid of public speaking. So if I got onto this New York City subway, I would be nervous. All of my instincts would say, look down, don't confront this person. What if I get laughed at? What if I get ridiculed? What if they're still on the subway? I would be afraid. But this man got on the subway. He saw this hate. And he went up to people and said, "Hey, do you have some hand sanitizer? Do you have baby wipes? Do you have some tissue? Anything we can do to get rid of this hate." And I know that if I was on that subway and he'd asked me if I had some hand sanitizer, I would say, "Yes, I do. Thank you so much. I've been waiting for you to help me to be the upstander I want to be." But our big problem is, what if that man never gets on the subway? What if it's just us? We need to be prepared for when we see these instances so we know how to respond. And that is what we are teaching our students. I did this PowerPoint actually at Adelphi University for 9th and 10th graders. And I had showed this slide. And after I did my presentation, a few hours later, I got an email in my inbox from a young lady that said after she saw this presentation with me, she went to go and play volleyball at a local park. And she saw a swastika. But because of what we had talked about, she knew exactly what to do. She reported it. She reported it to Communities Against Hate and the police. She took a photograph, and then she erased it. She is standing up to hate, and you can too. So HMTC, where I work, is committed to connecting students with the lessons of the Holocaust. We are a full 6-gallery exhibition talking about this hate and making sure that we make connections to today, connections to our community. Last year, we reached over 14,000 students across Long Island, and this year we are poised to exceed that goal. We are reaching more and more students. We're very active in District 10, which is Legislator Birnbaum's district, and I wanted to highlight in particular our work with Great Neck. Great Neck is one of our founding school districts. We are working with them at multiple different grade levels because this cannot be a one-time lesson. This is not a history lesson. It is a behavioral lesson. How do we behave? What are the lessons that we are learning? How can we change the world and empower our students to do the same? So what is the future? Usually when I'm with kids, I always say, the future is you. And I'm sure they're very sick. They hear it all the time, right? Because they're young and they're going to graduate and go do these amazing things. But even though I'm with a different audience today, the message is still the same. The future is you. Unfortunately, based on the statistics and what's going on in the world, I'm very confident that you will encounter racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. It will happen to you. It might happen in the form of a joke or a slur or an uncomfortable moment with people who are maybe your friends. What will you say? Will you kind of duck your head and try and ignore the situation or move on with the moment? Or will you speak up and say that we are not accepting that kind of intolerance? The joke is not funny. The slur is not okay. The graffiti must be reported. So I'm really calling on you today. Many of you in this room are in extraordinary positions of power. How will you raise your voice? And so what I would like to do now is introduce a young person who is a complete inspiration to me because she is raising her voice. I had the pleasure of meeting Sage Gladstone last year. She's a high school student in Nassau County and has always been an advocate for those in need. Whilst in middle school, Sage became the youngest volunteer for Days for Girls and the recipient of HMTC's Freelander Upstander Award. Sage is now a member of HMTC's Junior Advisory Board and speaks about the importance of young people raising their voices against intolerance and human rights violations. It is my pleasure to introduce Sage Gladstone.
Thank you, Helen, for your introduction. Good afternoon, county executives and legislators. I feel honored to have the opportunity to speak with you all today on Yom HaShoah and share with you why the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center means so much to me. I'm currently a 9th grader at Syosset High School, and I'm actively involved in my school service community, as well as my broader community on Long Island and beyond. As a student ambassador and a junior advisory board member at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, I've worked alongside Ms. Turner and Mr. Markowitz and senior board members advocating peace and change and encouraging others to stand up to injustice. HMTC takes great measure through its youth education and community outreach programs to teach the history and lessons of the Holocaust, as well as the dangers of anti-Semitism, racism, and bullying. My fellow board members and I know that even though we come from different backgrounds and age groups, we all share a common goal: to educate others and put an end to acts of hatred and discrimination, no matter how big or small. Last fall, I visited HMTC with my school's leadership class and attended the One Act of Courage program. We listened to Holocaust survivors speak about their horrific journeys to freedom, and we toured the museum where poignant, heartbreaking stories of tragedy were displayed. It was hard to fathom how anyone is able to endure such unimaginable acts of horror. The HMTC program teaches that genocide and atrocities such as the Holocaust don't happen overnight. Rather, they start with smaller acts of hate that go unchecked, gradually building momentum over time and spilling into all aspects of a community. This is why it's imperative for each and every one of us to help educate others and take swift action against the smallest act of hate as soon as we see it. One way I've been able to take a stand and help others is through the nonprofit called Days for Girls. Days for Girls is an organization that provides sustainable feminine hygiene kits to girls around the world in impoverished places like Nepal, Haiti, Africa, and parts of India. Without the necessary supplies, these girls miss up to 5 days of school each month and eventually drop out of school altogether. Not only are they deprived of an education, they are completely shunned from their communities and sent to huts in complete isolation, where they are further victimized by rape, predatory animals, and harsh weather conditions. I found out about this worldwide injustice when I was in 7th grade, and I felt a strong urge to take action. Since then, I have spearheaded numerous donation drives, given presentations within my middle school and high school, and invited Days for Girls representatives to come speak out to my peers. Thanks to my supportive school community, I was awarded a grant that covered the cost of fabric and other materials so my peers and I can help make feminine hygiene kits. Currently, I'm in the process of creating a Days for Girls group at my school and kicking off a pen pal writing campaign where we'll be able to personally connect with these girls around the world. As an advocate for equal, equitable, and inclusive education for everyone, I feel a strong sense of responsibility to continue educating my community about the plight of girls around the world. Last year, as an 8th grader, through my work with Days for Girls and other service efforts, I've led my school to become a No Place for Hate school, which is a title designated by the Anti-Defamation League. More recently, I started working with the nonprofit organization called Erase Racism. As a member of its student task force, I help educate others about the institutionalized and structural racism in our world, and especially here on Long Island, which ultimately leads to further segregation. I led part of an education reform conference at Molloy College last month. We presented the benefits of implementing what's called a culturally responsive and sustaining education, or CRSE, into school curriculums. Culturally responsive and sustaining education is a pedagogy designed to make curriculums more inclusive through various lesson plans and other educational resources. The material we learn in school is vital, and the more representative and well-rounded it is, the less divided we will be in our local and global communities. As a proud recipient of the 2018 Claire Friedlander Upstander Award, I'm determined to continue advocating for those in need and fighting injustice whenever I see it, whether it's local or global. Looking ahead to this summer, I'm very excited to start working as an intern on legislator Joshua Lafazan's campaign. I believe that advocating on a political level is the next step I need to take as I try to create the change I wish to see. As passionate and as excited as I am also sometimes overwhelmed when I think of how much more work we need to do. The last speech I gave, which was in November, and the speech I'm giving today, were both marked by mass attacks on the Jewish people. In November, the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history. And just last week, on the last day of Passover, a gunman fired 8 rounds into a synagogue, killing 1 person and injuring 3 others. And sandwiched between these 2 attacks was the Christchurch mosque shooting in New Zealand, killing 50 people and injuring 50 others, making it the deadliest attack in New Zealand's history. These tragic events and acts of hate are increasing worldwide, but I firmly believe there is still hope if we look for ways to help and educate others. It's important to remember that even the smallest gestures of hate are not to be tolerated. What may seem like a harmless comment at first or a seemingly playful gesture can fester and grow into the kind of hate that permanently divides us. Just less than a year ago, Baraboo High School portrayed true implicit bias and hate in their prom picture that went viral on Twitter. It's a photo that shows a group of students proudly displaying the Nazi salute. The photo's hashtag is #BaraboopProud. Instead of calling this photo quote-unquote controversial, as some have, as if there are 2 sides to the argument, we should be calling it what it is. There are never 2 sides to an act of hate, no matter how big or small. Instead of the Baraboo School District calling it quote-unquote extremely inappropriate, they should be condemning it unequivocally. In response to this blatant expression of anti-Semitism, the Auschwitz Memorial Museum located in Poland asserts, "This is why every single day we work hard to educate. We need to explain what is the danger of hateful ideology rising. Auschwitz with its gas chambers was at the very end of the long process of normalizing and accommodating hatred." This message perfectly aligns with what HMTC is all about and what I've learned from the One Act of Courage program last fall. We must all take a stand, even against the smallest gesture of hate. We must all keep telling our stories. I'm grateful to HMTC for strengthening my resolve to demand change. HMTC has taught me a deeper meaning of what it means to be an upstander and how much power we all hold as individuals. Please join me and let us stop the next atrocity by rising up individually and collectively. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for listening to my twofer story. I'm going to tell you 2 stories, and they're a little different from survivor stories because I'm a survivor who actually grew up in Brooklyn, a very happy child. The other part of my story is my husband's story, who grew up in France, a very unhappy child, but did survive. He was a hidden child during the war. So let me start with last train from Paris. My family and I were lucky enough to be able to get out of Paris as it was beginning to surrender to the Nazis. And so the story is called The Last Train. And I'll introduce you to my parents. to me, I was always called Mimi, and my older sister. We started preparing for our exodus from France in the mid-30s. After my sister was born, my maternal grandmother, who was in Paris with us, said things are getting worse in Germany. It'll probably be not a good situation. We both have family in the United States, and we'll talk to our family and see who can get us immigration papers under the American quota system. Both of my parents had come to France as teenagers, independently of each other. Let's see, Mom and Dad. Mom was a big city girl. She was from Warsaw. And she already had family in France, so when things became tough economically after the First World War, it was more or less natural for them to go to France to join the rest of the family. Dad was a little bit more unusual. He came from a small city near the Russian border. He was partially an orphan at a very young age. His father had died when he was 3. During the First World War, because there was a major battle in the vicinity of where he lived, Grandpa took the entire family, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, everyone, across the border to Russia, and he spent 3 years in Russia, which is what subsequently saved his life. He was not able to prove, when it came to proving who you are, where you're from, he was not able to prove his Polish identity because he'd left Poland when he was 16. His mother had died at 13. When he was 13, he went to live with an older sister, realized there was no future in Poland, and emigrated to France, which was the country of immigration if you could not afford to get to America. He came into France and overstayed his visa. He was an illegal immigrant in France. He was an itinerant farm worker and learned to speak French very, very fluently, and said, farming life is not for me, and went back to the city and went back to the skills he had learned through his family, which was as a skilled leather worker. When it came time for us to prepare those papers, Mom had become a French citizen, Dad was stateless, and because of the influence of one of our American cousins, he came in under the Nansen passport regulation. Thor Nansen was a Norwegian diplomat with the League of Nations who created a special category for the stateless who are fleeing the Red Russian Revolution. And I'm not sure how my father qualified, but he did. All right, now we're coming up to French ID papers. Mom is taken as a full-faced French citizen, maybe because she was very pretty, but the practice at the time was French citizens got the full-face treatment, and foreigners got the profile treatment, especially if you were Jewish, nurturing the anti-Semitic stereotypes. So there's my father in profile, that's my mom. In 1939, as you all know, Poland was invaded by the Nazis. The war was on. France had a mutual defense treaty to come to the aid of Poland. We were on vacation with my extended family and returned to Paris. My father immediately tried to join the French army and was rejected temporarily because of his age and his marital status. Other members of my family joined either the French Army or the French Foreign Legion. I'll tell you about that in a moment. The beginning of the war in France was called the Phony War. There wasn't a great deal of military action except in the north near the German border. That was in September. By February, March of the following year, 1940, the war became very hot, and my father at the end of May was actually called up to serve the French country, his French country. He had told my mother to pack a suitcase, be prepared to leave in a minute's notice. Our papers were not only all intact, but he had actually prepared an escape route that would take us through the heart of France and across the border into Spain. And so he's called up and he goes to his commanding officer with all his documents and says, could I leave? If I stay, I may be killed, my family will be unprotected, and we're Jewish. And his commanding officer said, get out of here. And he picked up my mother and we took the last train out of France as the government is trying to organize itself in some way. And we are on the road towards Bordeaux. The train is bombed. We get off the train and we start walking towards Bordeaux, which becomes a closed city because the French government had gathered in Bordeaux. The American government was trying to find a place to go. It was truly in shambles, and there were millions of refugees on the road. And my father meets the American consulate officer who prepared his papers, and she recognizes him in the crowd because his papers were so unusual. And she suggests that they join forces, and she says, I can drive, but I don't speak French very well. And my father said, I can't drive, but I do speak French very well. And so they rented a truck, and we crossed the border from the Atlantic coast across the Pyrenees to the Mediterranean coast. I brought along my shoes because I did a lot of walking in that time period, and if you'll look, you'll see a photo. The heels are worn down. So these are one of the things my parents saved from that trip. Let's see. Okay, my shoes. So we walked from Monitor, actually, towards Bordeaux, met the American consulate officer whose name may be lost in time. I'm still dealing with the translation of papers my father had kept, and I don't read Polish, I read French. So I'm hoping I'll find it somewhere. And when we were on the, is that the map? Yes. We go from Paris to Bordeaux, across the Pyrenees to Perpignan, which is about 50 miles, 60 miles from the Spanish border. We part ways. The American consulate officer goes to Marseille, where the American consulate will exist for the next few years. We cross the border, and because I was not quite 2 years old, I have no memories of this. However, several years ago when I was there, my husband said to me, do you want to see where you crossed the road, near the border? And I said, of course. So we took the back road, and now there's a super highway. And I had a kind of flashback image of my mother holding me, and so we crossed into Spain. We were not allowed to stay in Spain. As you probably know, Franco was a fascist government, and a very poor one because of the recent civil war. So he accepted transit money, and we never got off the train, and we stayed in Spain, came through Spain into Portugal. Very similar situation in Portugal. Salazar was also a fascist governor, and in Portugal, in Lisbon, we boarded a Greek freighter that was part of a large convoy crossing the North Atlantic, necessary in those days because of the German torpedoes. We left France, we left Paris about June 1st, I believe, 1940. We arrived in America August 11th, 1940. I was detained in Ellis Island because I had broken out in a rash. My mother convinced the doctor that this was a rash due to stress and trauma. It wasn't until a few years ago I realized I had had the chicken pox. I had come down with the shingles, consequences of actions. My father had sent cables to our American family in New York, please meet us, the boat is docking, and the cables were delayed because these were strategic information that was not allowed to be sent out until the appropriate moment. And so my father said his first word in New York, his first American word, which was taxi, same word in French. And the taxi driver, being a New York taxi driver, took us on the scenic route of Manhattan. And my father spent all his money on that ride, and we had $10 left. And so he took us to HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. And we were there for 3 days until our family came and collected us. And I grew up in Williamsburg and then in Midwood, a very happy little girl. I do remember things from that wartime period. I remember my father and my parents buying things with rations, and after D-Day, sending them to the family in France. And actually, it was my husband's family. He was sending the things that they had collected from the grocery. I remember coming home from school somewhere towards the end of the war, but it wasn't quite VE Day. It must have been after VE Day. My mother was crying bitterly, and mommies are not supposed to cry, so of course, why are you crying? And she's holding a letter that comes from the Red Cross. I recognize the symbol. And in the letter, there is a description of what happened to one of her two sisters. I'm not sure if it was the sister that had remained in Warsaw and died in the ghetto, or it was a sister that remained in France and had been rounded up in the Grand Rafle of 1942. And she explained in ways a 7-year-old could understand the complete horrors of the war and how it had impacted on all of us. A very early lesson. But the next story I'm going to tell you about is my husband's story. Oh, these were some of the travel documents that we needed to get to go from point A to point B. Oh, New York. That's my American auntie in the back. She had come from Poland to Denver right after the First World War. She was very American. My father, my mother, holding on to my older sister, and me. So I can date that because the clothes are the same from an earlier picture. And my husband's story is called The Kindness of Strangers. He called it that because his entire family, his mother, his father, his older brother, survived because people reached out to them. They were able to reach out to people who gave them significant help and saved their lives under these horrendous circumstances. So let me introduce you to them. My mother-in-law and father-in-law, also from Poland originally. My father-in-law could not find work in Poland as a skilled leather worker. My father, we're distantly related, invited him to come to Paris where he could use his skills, realized he could make a living in Paris, sent for his wife and his oldest son, and David was born in Paris in 1932. There is a 10-year difference between Jacques, his brother, and David, and that is part of the story. David with his father, 2 different vacation periods. Everybody in the family seems to have had a gift for languages, spoke French fluently without any discomfort level, except for my poor father-in-law, who maintained either a Polish or Yiddish accent. And it was sort of his undoing and his saving at the same time. He looked like a French undercover police officer. He always wore a white shirt. He always had shine shoes. He almost always wore a suit. And a very proper gentleman. And David, who is a very large-sized child, wasn't fat, he was just a very big child, did not fit what we call the stereotypical look of a French child. He had red hair, green eyes, and freckles. He was a very different-looking kid. David in 1938. And this is a map of France after the armistice was signed. France was divided into 2 nations. The northern half was the occupied part of France by the Nazis. The southern half became a separate country called Vichy France, and the president of Vichy France was the beloved Marshal, war hero of First World War, Maréchal Pétain. And there was only one problem, or several problems, with Vichy France. It was called the Free Zone, but it wasn't really free because Maréchal Pétain was a great admirer of Hitler and his policies. So although it was less problematic than northern France, it was still a major problem. So there are 2 countries within one with some small differences. David's family on the eve of the war, father in the back row, his brother Jacques, and Uncle Morris, who's visiting from America, my mother-in-law, David with the mumps, and a cousin who had come to Paris, thought she would marry a dashing Frenchman, didn't find one, went back to Warsaw and was killed. So, human tragedy in photos. This is David's scouting group during the occupation. David's mother owned a pushcart in a very poor working class area of Paris that was located between 2 strategic railroad stations, the only area that was bombed. David's brother joins the French Foreign Legion during the war. David, and after the armistice, he asked to be sent to the town where David was sent, courtesy of friends and neighbors, for protection in case Paris was bombed. They realized that they haven't heard from their parents. They traveled back from the middle of France to Paris, and within days, Jacques is imprisoned in a French concentration camp. David's mother forces his escape And I wish I had the time to share all the details with you, but she actually walks into the village where the camp is located, tells someone she meets, and she says, I'm here to make my son escape. And so they do. They make him escape. And eventually he joins the resistance. David's mother goes back to Paris. There is a roundup of Jews, and they are hidden in an apartment for 2 weeks with the neighbors bringing them food and supplies, and neighbors providing for their escape out of occupied Paris into unoccupied Paris. They are forced to wear the Star of David. This is my uncle's, and it says Juif, which in every country it was the language of the occupied nation. And so I have Uncle Leon's Star of David as a memento of those horrendous times. When we were in Bonne-la-Hollande, where the concentration camp was located, there is a memorial to the people who were there starving under more stringent conditions than in Dachau. My little cousin Madeleine, who had been David's playmate, who was a top-ranking student in Paris, because they ranked from top to bottom, was caught in the roundup, separated from her parents, who were immediately sent to Auschwitz. She was sent to Bonne-la-Hollande and subsequently sent to Auschwitz. The other memorial is in the town where David's parents eventually escaped into Vichy, France, and were helped across the border. This is where they escaped into Free France, running through the forest. That's the town where he was harbored. During the war, he served, he had been there before. The priest came to visit and talked to David, and David said, I'm not converting. And the priest said, I'm here to save your life. You will come help me serve Mass. You will join the Catholic Boy Scouts. You will be a member of the community. And for 2 years, he was a Catholic little boy in Paris. So that's David. This is the village. There were several Jewish children being hidden there. Nobody knew about it. Nobody talked about it. It wasn't until many years later that we realized, oh, that little boy that I used to beat in chess, he was Jewish too. So beautiful little village. And that was Granny, who, David had a harsh life being protected because it wasn't his loving mother, but he was protected and loved. And Granny, who did not speak French, only spoke Provençal, wrote him in the will. So he was a member of the family. David, during the war, where he had worked to save money to buy a suit, because although his mother sent him supplies, it was not easy. And David after the war. So the purpose of my narrative is to say that upstanding people are out there to help victims. We just have to remember who we are in our role as upstanders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mireille. And our last speaker today is Legislative Assistant to my office, Josephine Maraste.
The story of the Holocaust wasn't one that belonged to my family. I learned about the Holocaust in the first grade, when my classmate's grandmother addressed a group of six-year-olds. I vividly recall how we sat cross-legged on the floor by the windows in the far corner of the classroom. As the Holocaust survivors' real-life story intensified, I quickly became fearful and began to play with my classmates' braided hair. After all, at the time of her story, I too was her age. Her story was foreign, unreal, and incomprehensible, yet so incredibly relatable on a human level. Over time, our school curriculum included additional firsthand stories and books by other survivors. My growing interest led me to apply to be a participant in Great Neck South High School's first Facing History and Ourselves class. the same year as September 11th. The mission of the class was to engage students of multicultural backgrounds in understanding racism, religious intolerance, and prejudice, while increasing students' ability to relate to history in their own lives and promote a greater understanding of making moral choices that promote civic responsibility in a democracy. Surveys of students who took this course show that 69% feel strongly that it is their responsibility to be involved in state and local issues. 43% feel strongly that they can make a difference in their community. And 92% of teachers agree that their students are more likely to stand up for what they believe in, even when others don't. May we all be upstanders, if and when the opportunity arises. I congratulate Sage Gladstone on being the recipient of the Holocaust Museum and Tolerance Center's Freelander Upstander Award, and honor all educators, like my former teacher, Mr. Ehrlich, sitting here, who taught me when I was a student. Thank you.
I'd actually like to call up all our speakers, Helen, Mireille, and Sage, Steve. So at this time, I'd like to present our speakers with a certificate of recognition for sharing with us your story and for all the work that you do for the people in Nassau County at the HMTC to promote tolerance and fairness and to teach people from the horrors of the Holocaust and to offer hope. So I thank you so much, Mireille.